Hi everyone. We're going to talk about a perspective on what people consider the impossible or the improbable. Now, when somebody says something is impossible or improbable, the chances of it becoming true means it's very, very small that it can become true. Okay, so maybe we should reevaluate what that means overall. If you think about where we stand at nowadays, we have the TV, we have the internet, we have computers, we have the World Wide Web. We have so many things that we don't even realize they're there. We take it for granted. Let's rewind 200 years ago, or maybe even 60 years ago, or 100 years ago. Most of the things that we have today, 60 years ago, realistically did not exist. The internet, cell phones. We had computers, but at the time, they were really, really big calculators overall. That's what they could do. They could do a little bit of thinking, but compared to the types of what we consider computer technology today, it didn't even come close. Rewind 100 years ago or 200 years ago, if people were to see us now, it would be like things that they could have never imagined. Even some of the things they thought of 200 years ago, they considered improbable or impossible. You think about 40 years ago, the stuff that existed on sci-fi movies, stuff on movies that back then never anyone really ever thought about. And I'm going to use the example of Star Trek when it first came out. These were a show that imagined the capacity to go at really, really fast speeds through space and all these weird little technologies like transportation from one place to the other using matter, what we call matter stream transport, or whatever the hell that means. The other side of the coin is they had these communicators as well too. And back then, when they first came out and they saw these communicators, and they weren't real, but they were just toys or so that they used to tell a story. Everybody's like, oh my gosh, really, really cool. It didn't exist at the time, of course not. We had landline phones, and it had to be a telegraphing service or a telephone service that was really complex, and it didn't work as well as these communicators where you can communicate from, the starship would be, up in space somewhere, and they would be on the ground surface, and 200-300 miles away, a wireless signal, it bounced and it worked really fast and it worked really well. Where are we at today? Back then, it was considered almost improbable that something like that happened. It only imagined in the movies as though, oh, it would be so cool to have it. Our world today, we have it. So it was impossible at one point. It was improbable at one point, but now it's not. So you think about, let's talk about 1,000 years ago, or 800 years ago, 600 years ago. What's the difference between the sci-fi movies now versus back then? Let's talk about Greece, when they thought Zeus and all these gods. They told stories about them, the gods having the ability to do something at a thought. Athena was the most beautiful person in the world, and most beautiful of the gods, and how Icarus could fly through the air, and all these things as well too. A chariot that flew through the sky. Humanity thought those things were for the gods. That was their methodology of thinking. And what did that mean overall? To them, being a regular human being, that's improbable, impossible that anything could happen that way. They would never be able to do that. Fast forward to nowadays, in the last 20, 30 years, that chariot in the sky, we have airplanes. Doing things when it comes to beauty, we can age now healthier. We live a lot longer now. Back then, the average age, life expectancy, was in the 40s, maybe even 50s, 40s, really, really low overall. We have extended life expectancy to in the 70s now, almost double. But of course, as you get older, you kind of get uglier or whatever it is. You get less beautiful. But we've been able to slowly fix that as well too, with improved health, improved healthcare technologies, medical technologies, the way we see our own genetics, the way we take care of our health. And it's allowed people to be a lot more attractive over a longer period of time. Back then, health was not really great, antibiotics, penicillin, stuff like that didn't exist 100, 200 years ago. No, actually like 300 years ago. All that stuff didn't exist, so that's the reason why people died. Nowadays, we have the ability to combat infections. Nowadays, with this pandemic, 100 years ago, that was a problem. Killed millions of people. Millions upon millions of people. Because they had to wait it out. They protected themselves. They isolated themselves to wait out a pandemic 100 years ago. Do we sort of do the same things? Not completely, not as much as they did it. What we do have is the technology to advance the process of a vaccination nowadays. So within a year's worth of time, we can develop a whole entire vaccine, get it tested, and rush it out so that more people can survive from it. 100 years ago, those technologies did not exist in the 1900s. So about 120 years ago, things have gotten a lot better. But back then, they would consider what we do nowadays improbable, impossible. Similarly to looking at Zeus and Mount Olympus and all those things that people told stories about. They told mythological stories about, Theseus and his thing, the Iliad and the Odyssey. They were stories. And they told all these impossible tales of things that would happen. But what is it? It's a story. Sci-fi is a story as well too. The only difference is the story now is visual. We get to see acting. We get to see all of this. But it's still, if you look at the baseline, it's still a story that tells something that is so impossible that you would never think that it would happen. Well, 200 years ago, all the stuff we have nowadays, all the technologies, all the wonders of the humanity has created, have innovated. 200 years ago, almost all of this was impossible, improbable. We have light systems, we have electricity, we have solar panels, we have batteries. Back then, they did have sort of the beginnings of it, but it didn't work very well. Similarly, when you look at Star Trek and their communicators, back then we had the telephone system, we had a communication system. But it was so improbable to think that it didn't require a wire. It didn't require somebody on the other line to help make that phone call exist. The telecommunication boards where they would have to plug and unplug these wires or so to make a phone call from one place to the other. Nowadays, those are almost entirely automated systems. No person has to do it anymore. And on top of that, it's not just communication, across the city, across the town, across the United States of America. Now it's worldwide. We can call somebody at a push of a button in literally seconds to the other half of the world. We can call somebody at the International Space Station if we wanted to. That all exists now. It's made our world smaller, but all these things were improbable. There's a lot of things that we still consider improbable. In the next 10 years, we are finally starting to have cars that fly. Maybe not cars, maybe vehicles. Mode of transportation, individual mode of transportation in the air. Kind of like that chariot. It's going to exist. Back then, that was only for the gods. Well, we're not gods, we're humans. But what are we looking at that people say are impossible? There's a lot of things that we consider impossible right now. Traveling up to the speed of light. We're developing faster means of transportation, even through the cosmos, through space, but it's still really, really slow. If you compare it to the speed of light, we would be lucky right now to be able to have something that even goes 1% the speed of light. Are we getting better? Yes, it seems like such an impossible task. But is that a good thing? That is actually a really good thing, because somebody who watches those stories, movies, whatever you want to call it, and all they see is these impossible things that are in the movies. And we continuously and diligently work, well, maybe not in our lifetime, not even the next 2 or 3 generations, but humanity as a whole has always innovated and made things better and better and better. Have a lot of failures along the way, geopolitical issues, wars, differences and conflicts or so that occur, but humanity always innovates, and we will continue to innovate. 100 years from now, when you look at the possibility 100 years from now, it would be like us saying, hey, those things that exist are for the gods, similar to the stuff that exists nowadays. Well, when people who thought Zeus existed and all those mythological Greek mythologies existed, they thought those chariots are for the gods. A lot of things nowadays we see as impossible and improbable, and people can't wrap their head, well, it doesn't exist now. Well, who cares if it doesn't exist now? But at some point it will exist, because somebody's going to make it happen. Even when it comes to the stuff that you see on Star Wars or Star Trek, traveling from one galaxy to the next, or traveling from our solar system to the next solar system. Will it happen in our lifetime? Probably not. Will it happen in 200 years? Probably not. 300 years from now, to go from our solar system to the next one, is it possible? It's not impossible. It just requires a little bit more understanding. As we've slowly learned, back then they didn't have physics and sciences. We've developed sciences. We understand the world better, and because of that we developed health, so we are healthier overall. Technically, if I existed 300 years ago, I'm about 8-9 years away from my death. But because of the way the world works nowadays, because of the understanding that we have of the impossible, it's not going to be my health that causes me to die in 8 years. It will be some kind of unnatural event. If you look at how healthy I am overall, I'm still looking at a good 20, 30, maybe 40 years of life ahead of me. And overall, that's the cool part, is you live twice as long as somebody 500 years ago thought, which means living twice as long means what? We're inhuman. We're almost immortal to them, because we get to live 2 of their lifetimes when they only get to live 1. That's the impossible to them. So where do we go from here? Well, 80 years, 75 years old on average right now. Can we extend that? Seems impossible. And people think, oh, by the time I get 120, you see all these people who are so old and 120 and they're just decrepit and their quality of life goes away. Well, let's just look at somebody 500 years ago who looked at 45 or 50 as being decrepit, old, and similar to somebody who is 75 years old nowadays. Well, technically, I should be old and decrepit then, compared to when somebody looks at me from 500 years ago. I'm not. And you find that nowadays people in their 60s are living robust, healthy lives. So saying 100 years old, you're going to be old and decrepit. Well, in today's standard, yes. 100 years from now, there's a good chance that we can be 120, 130 years old and still have overall enriched, healthy lives. Seems impossible, but if you keep on thinking that way, that this world stagnates and stays as is, then you're the person who can't see that future. You're the person who could not ever imagine that the cell phone could exist the way it does 100 years ago. Well, don't believe in that. Don't believe that it can't exist, because the impossible, humanity has always been able to create what they thought was impossible. Where are we at today? Is it going to get better? Absolutely. All these issues with global warming, the pandemic of the coronavirus now this year, all these things go away. People will find better solutions. Whenever there's a problem, just think of a math problem. It has to have a solution. There is some solution. Even in calculus, whatever it is that racked your brain and you couldn't figure it out at your homework or when you took a test, there is an actual solution. But that's the key thing of all of that. Education was practice to figure out solutions to a problem, is to give you the tools necessary to learn how to figure out solutions to a problem, no matter how impossible it is. People hate it because they're not good at it. When they can't figure out an answer, they get frustrated and they don't like it. That's okay. We will have an answer to every problem. It doesn't matter if it's the pandemic or if it's global warming. Millions of solutions exist. You just have to believe that those impossibilities, those improbabilities, it's not because they're impossible, not because they're improbable. It's because we just need more time to figure out a solution. Thank you.